Welcome to the Tennessee Williams and New Orleans Literary Festival. We are here with Minrose Gwin, who was our wonderful fiction judge for the writing contest this year. Welcome, Minrose.
Thank you, Teresa. I'm so happy to be here.
I wish it could be in person, but it is what it is. So
yeah, me too. But we are still here, aren't we?
That's right. And we will be together again one day.
Yes, we sure will.
Now, Minrose is the author of 3 novels, The Queen of Palmyra, Promise, and The Accidentals, which we are going to be talking about here later. She's also the author of a memoir, Wishing for Snow, and for Remembering Medgar Evers, Writing the Long Civil Rights Movement. I also know that you run a lot of writing workshops, and you were a professor at a university teaching new students how to write better. As a judge for our contest, which you did a fantastic job, thank you. Our winning piece was by Michael Pearce of Oakland, California, and it was called Jace. And I'm wondering, what do you look for in a piece of fiction? What is it that sparks for you?
Well, in the case of Jace, it was the intensity of the emotion of the story. We always think of short stories as having a kind of condensation of action, emotion, character, and so forth. In a way that novels don't. Novels are more spun out, more gradual, and so forth. And there were so many good stories in this group of finalists. There were 11 finalists. There were so many good stories. I found so much to admire in this group of stories, and it was really a joyful experience, to judge this contest. But what jumped out at me from Jace, the story Jace, was just this intensity of emotion. A father who loves his son so much and is so eager to hold on to this teenager who is just as eager to assert his independence and pull away. And this is an old story, really. The teenager pulling away from the parent experiencing this sense of grief and loss. But this story presented this tension and in a new way. And so I always look, in general, when I'm judging a work of fiction or any work of writing, that there's got to be a spark there that makes me feel like these are real people. These are not characters. These are real people, and they are experiencing emotions that are, as Faulkner said, the human heart in conflict with itself, which is the greatest theme of all, as Faulkner said. And so that is what I look for in a work of fiction.
Let's talk a little bit about your book, The Accidentals. I am so in awe of this book. It is timely, it is powerful. There are moments where I had to put it down and just sit with the feelings that it brought up in me. It's a wonderful book about women that in the 1950s and 60s, pre-Roe versus Wade, and how that affects their life. And I want to start by asking you, what does the title mean?
Well, the title is kind of a technical term that's used for migratory animals, especially birds, who are blown off course from their regular migration. And they find them, you will look out your window. For example, I looked out my window one day when in North Carolina and saw a painted bunting Now, painted buntings are not unheard of in the Piedmont area of North Carolina, but they are rare, very rare. And I thought about that bird, and I thought about the fact that it was probably blown off its regular course, perhaps had gotten separated from its flock. And it struck me that the characters in this novel are in almost every case accidentals. They get blown off course. You know, we all have our, you know, we're going to plot out our course in life. You know, we often think that with great hubris, you know, that we can do that. And then, of course, we get blown off course. And that's what life is this constant being blown off course and resituating oneself. That's what makes life interesting. That's what makes it thrilling, but that's also what makes it hard. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I chose the title, The Accidentals.
It's wonderful to see that theme all the way through the book. That is every time I came across it, I was like, oh, there it is. Okay, this makes sense. You wrote this with 7 narrators, which I'm a playwright. So for me to have that many people is an ensemble play. And so I know how difficult writing an ensemble piece is. How difficult was it to write 7 different narrators and have them be individuals?
Well, it was really challenging, and it really stretched me as a writer. I mean, I think one of the things that we as writers try to do, you can think, I'm sure you feel this way about playwriting as well, is that each work that you do, you try to stretch yourself. You try to do something a little different to learn. I mean, you want to learn as a writer. So the challenge here was to try to create 7 different voices, not just 7 different characters and from each character's perspective, but these characters actually are speaking, you know, to the reader in the I, you know, persona. And so my first novel, The Queen of Palmyra, had one woman looking back on her life as a young girl and speaking in the first person, which was simple enough. It was a difficult book to write because of its subject matter. But it was a pretty straightforward point of view. And then my second novel, Promise, was a third person, omniscient, but yet very closely attuned to 2 characters' lives as they attempted to negotiate the aftermath of a horrendous tornado. But this novel was totally different. And not only did I need these 7 voices, but all 7 of them needed to be very distinctive. Because what you don't want is 7 voices who sound kind of alike, you know. And so this was particularly difficult with the 2 young girls in the novel, Grace and June McAllister, age 10 and 12 at the time the novel starts. And then on top of that, the novel spans a half a century. And so these characters are speaking, you know, as time goes forward and as they age themselves. So that was really, really challenging. So I felt like I learned a lot from writing this book.
I think that's very interesting that even, you know, even every time you write something, you learn something new about yourself and how you write, and you push yourself. I think that's amazing. With these 7 voices and this being such a challenge for you, how long did it take you to write this?
I guess from the beginning to the very, very last revision, and there were quite a lot of revisions on this book, both done by me, but also they were done by me. All of them were, of course, were done by me, but instigated is what the word I'm looking for, by me. There were several revisions from that point of view. And then my agent, had ideas about the book that needed work, that, things. And then my editor worked with me long and hard on the book too. And so there was a good bit of more input in this book, on this book, than any of my others, from outside sources. Of course, I always ask a few, one or two, maybe three writer friends to look at my work before I even send it to an agent. And I get feedback from them as well. So it was a long process. I would say maybe between 4 or 5 years, actually.
I think that's important for emerging writers to hear, that you don't have to be a fast writer. You don't have to have something done in 6 months. You can take your time with a piece and make it your piece and have it be your voice. I've been working on a play for 5 years now, and I finally finished it. So I feel like, it's good news to hear that it can take you a while.
Yeah. And it's a matter of finishing it and finishing it and finishing it and finishing it and finishing it. And I feel like, okay, I finished it for now. That's what I always say. Okay, for now it's finished. But who knows about tomorrow? One thing I like to say too to emerging writers is that there's really no substitute for time. You really need to be away from a manuscript for a period of time, whether, I guess the time would vary per writer, but there's a period that has to happen before you can go back and look at it. You can't just finish it and then say, okay, I'm going to go back and read it. I'm going to go back and read it now, tomorrow. You need sometime a period of months, sometime a period of weeks before you can look at it more objectively as a reader, because every writer has to carry a reader, your ideal reader, in your mind when you go back to revise the book. You have to approach it from a reader's perspective, which is hard sometimes when you've written it.
It is difficult to get that distance from it. Yeah,
it really is.
Would you please read from your book for us?
I will. I'd love to do that. In honor of Michael Pearce and Jay's, let me just say that, Jay's is about a father's desperate effort to hold on to his son. And this passage that I want to read is about a daughter's failed attempt to make her mother happy and thereby to keep her mother alive and hold on to her mother. So this book begins the first chapter, as you know, but for readers who haven't read it, the first chapter begins with the mother, Olivia McAllister, lying in her bed at home, bleeding to death from a botched backwoods abortion. And so that is the first chapter. And I'm not telling you anything to spoil the book, because by the end of the first chapter, the mother has died. So I'm going to read from the second chapter, which is a chapter narrated by her daughter, Jude. And I'm going to read the first part of the second chapter, and then I'm going to jump to the last couple of paragraphs of the second chapter. The year my mother went and did what she did, I was 10 and my sister, Grace McAllister, was 12. We lived in a little clunker of a town in South Mississippi called Opelika, where my father, Holly McAllister, worked as an accountant at the local lumber mill. I fought myself. I should have seen it, the disaster that was about to befall us. Oh, I can make excuses. I can say I was just a girl. Over the course of my short life, I should have tried to stop it. I'd become a finely tuned gauge of my mother's many and varied moods. I could tell by the way she crunched her Rice Krispies in the morning what kind of day lay ahead. A toss of her head could make my heart leap in my throat. So that night, at the traveling rendition of Madame Butterfly, when she flinched at the peculiar way the cherry blossoms fell, I knew that trouble lay coiled in the wings, ready to strike. The blossoms were hard plastic, so they came down hard, as if descending from some terrible calamity at a great height, hitting the gym floor with a splat and a clatter rather than gently troubling the air the way real cherry blossoms would have. When they started to fall in clumps, not individually as they ought to have, my mother began to cry. I should have comforted her, patted her hand. I should have told her to listen to the music and not worry about the stupid blossoms. Instead, I told her to buck up. What kind of performance was she expecting from a Fleabag opera company that set up shop in a high school gym stinking of wet sneakers? And why in heaven's name had she dragged a defenseless 10-year-old with a tendency toward bronchitis out in a bone-chilling February rain to witness this shambles of a show, this disaster, all of which made her cry harder? I knew the answer to the second question. I was the last port in my mother's stormy life. Olivia Lamond McAllister had no friends whatsoever. It's 1957, mind you, and here's a woman who doesn't go to sewing circles or potluck suppers. She doesn't belong to the DAR Junior League or Ladies Hospital Auxiliary. She doesn't play bridge or shop for recreational pleasure or wear a girdle or eat egg and olive salad with her girlfriends at K&T drugstore. She doesn't even take Christmas hams to the poor. She thinks women who engage in such activities are brainless nincompoops, idiots, every one of them, she tells my father as he tries to get her out and about and tells her she's stuck up. She says birds have more brains. But the number one reason she and I are crouched on a bleacher watching fake cherry blossoms being catapulted to the gym floor is that my mother loves the sound of sound. When I was younger, I found this mildly entertaining, the way she lost herself in Glenn Miller and bird calls and the whistle of the tea kettle, the way she glued herself to sound, composed her life across its chords and cadences. As the years went by, though, and she began to twitter and coo and sing full-throatedly, I became deeply afraid. I came to fear that she'd never find her way out of the maze of sound and return to the world of seeing in clarity, of you come and you go, a world I had chosen without a second thought from day one. So here I am, the shivering beside my mother on a bench in the drafty school gymnasium, watching as the Japanese lady in the cheesy kimono frets on the gym floor with her little boy. She waits endlessly for her man to come back to her when everybody with a brain in their head knows he never will, jerk that he is. Meanwhile, my mother hums to the music and stares up into the rafters, tears galloping down her cheeks. Her powder is streaked and clotted, the left pick in her updo sagging alarmingly. What I'm not prepared for will come at the end when the Japanese lady, her eyes drawn to slits, she really Japanese, I wonder, gives her little boy to that wastrel of a father and his new wife, like the poor kid's a dress she's outworn. Then, lo and behold, just to top things off, she takes a monster knife to herself, harikiri style. This, in my opinion, is an overreaction of massive proportion, an unnatural thing for a mother to do. You don't just fly off and leave your little child like that.
I do want to follow up with a couple of questions for our emerging writers. I'd like to know, what is the best piece of advice you've ever received as a writer? And what is the worst piece of advice you've ever received?
Oh, I think the best piece of advice I've ever received as a writer is put your, you know what, down in the chair and write. You know? That, and also to read good fiction. If you want to write fiction, read good fiction. If you want to write poetry, read good poetry. I also find it helpful to read poetry because I really try to listen to the language of the words that I produce, and poetry, reading poetry helps me do that. I guess the worst, I wouldn't say the worst advice, but I'd say the worst experience I ever had as a writer was when I was first starting out with my novel, my first novel, The Queen of Palmyra. And I got into a workshop in which the writers in there were all much younger than I was, and very interested in science fiction. Most of them, I don't know how this happened to me, but most of them were very much into writing science fiction. And they just said they couldn't relate to the work that I was producing. And it really just kind of did me in for a while. And I guess I would say that no matter what what critique that you get in a writing workshop, you need to weigh it with your own inner voice and your own inner sense of yourself as a writer who has unique skills and talents and concerns in your writing. And you need to take everything you hear, even from the most, the best teachers, with something of a grain of salt, and try and trust yourself. Trust yourself. I don't mean not listen to other people's critiques of your work, but do take those critiques with a grain of salt. Because when I was first starting out, I came to my creative writing experience late in life. I had been a literary scholar for my whole career, my whole academic career, and have actually written 4 books of literary criticism and cultural criticism before I wrote my memoir, which then turned me toward fiction. And so I think I had a better sense of myself as a writer, but I think some younger writers who didn't have the writing experience that I had had before might be just so discouraged that they might just turn away from writing. And I'm glad that I didn't do that, and I hope that other emerging writers don't do that as well.
It's clearly a case of finding your audience.
Yeah, for sure. That was definitely, those people were definitely not my audience.
I'd like to know, what are you reading right now? Because the advice we always get as writers is read, and read a lot. So what are you reading right now?
Well, I just finished 2 wonderful collections of short fiction. One collected stories, If We Had Wings, by my dear friend who died recently, Randall Keenan. And this is a wonderful collection of short fiction, long awaited, from Randall Keenan, who was just a remarkable writer. His loss to the world is so great. And then I've been reading the uncollected stories of my friend, another friend, North Carolina friend, Alan Gorganis. And those stories have been just wonderful to read. Also, I've kind of gotten on a short story reading kick. I think the judging of the Tennessee Williams Festival finalist sent me there. And also, I'm reading a memoir right now that I've meant to read for a long time, and that's Roxane Gay's very powerful memoir, Hunger.
Wonderful choices. These are good books that I'm gonna write down and look up too.
Oh yes, they're all three just wonderful.
On behalf of the festival, Minrose, thank you so much for being our judge this year, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Teresa, and I just enjoyed it so much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Hi, I'm Michael Pearce in Oakland, California, and I'm going to read my story that won the prize for fiction in the Tennessee Williams New Orleans Literary Festival. The story is called Jace. Time to lighten up, Martin told himself. You got gulls squawking in a blue sky. You got a gentle wind blowing in from Hawaii or some such place. You got the hot of the white sand and the staticky rattle of the Pacific against the California coast and the smell of whatever plankton or seashells or rotting kelp. A feisty wave shoved him forward as he ambled out of the surf. So okay, he told himself. You also got a teenage boy stewing in a cheap motel room, doing his best to mess up this little vacation, doing his best to make your special time together a misery. But come on, the operative words here are teenage boy, for Christ's sakes. You knew what you were getting into. He didn't ask to spend the last 4 days of his summer vacation alone with his old man. This was your idea, so make it work and lighten the fuck up. He shook the sand off a large blue and green striped towel and mopped the water from his skin. The fact was, things had gone mostly okay so far. He was pretty sure Jace had enjoyed the drive out from Pasadena, listening to metal hip-hop on the fancy sound system in the brand new rented Sequoia. Not an unhip ride, what with its off-road capability and GPS and Bluetooth and satellite radio. In the hazy slog of the Friday rush hour, they'd kicked up the AC and cranked the bass on the Bose speakers. And Jace had pretty quickly dropped his mask of remote boredom, had become almost chatty, recounting in elaborate detail the plot of a recent action movie, the slightly stammering narrative punctuated by his goofy grin full of orange-capped braces. When his favorite station slipped out of reach, they tuned in a comedy station on satellite and found themselves laughing at corny radio shows from the 50s. Jace even liked their digs in the seedy Vagabond Motor Hotel and the little seafood joint they discovered, not to mention the video arcade and the bowling alley on Thompson Boulevard. And somehow he'd met and befriended Willie, the son of the motel's unpleasant manager, a skinny kid a couple years older than Jace who walked with an odd limp and affected a menacing world-weary sneer that made Martin uncomfortable, though he was secretly thrilled to see Jace holding his own, hanging with an older boy and maintaining some cool. Last night, as they lay in their squishy beds watching Nicolas Cage rescue his daughter from the clutches of a psychopath, Jace going on during the commercials and the metallic crackle of his adolescent voice about the silly pranks he and his buddies played of Mr. Brogan, the clueless history teacher at Roosevelt. Things felt like they should. Two guys, father and son, kicking back. Even his craving for cigarettes was less. After Jace fell asleep, he decided he could make it through the night without slipping out for a smoke. He missed Jace. Differently from how he'd missed him a couple hours ago in the Denny's on East Harbor, the kid slumped over his butterscotch sundae, mumbling between gulps that he'd rather watch baseball on TV all afternoon than walk down to the beach. He'd sat staring at his son's sour, pimply face with its downy shadow of a mustache and pouty mouth and felt a rancorous nostalgia for the boy Jace used to be just a few years ago, when he still knew that he needed his dad and wanted to go places with him, would still put his hand, smaller than and pudgy, into Martin's, sometimes even in public. On the drive back to the motel, he tried to convince Jace to come out and do something with him, something outdoors and active, something, anything. It didn't have to be the beach. that he didn't do in Pasadena with Adrienne and her hotshot scientist boyfriend. But Jace simply sat there shrugging, wagging that floppy brown veil of hair across his face and mumbling vague negatives until Martin gave him a sharp slap on the shoulder and raised his voice. "Snap out of it, Jace. This is our vacation. Time's running out." "Yeah, right," Jace had muttered. "Get physical, like that's going to change anything." When they reached the motel, Martin, silently fuming, had walked quickly through the long bedroom area and the little kitchen behind it to the back patio to grab his swimsuit and towel from a chair, then stomped back through the front door. Jace was already reclined on a bed, fiddling with the remote, and Martin left without a word, slamming the door hard. He pulled his faded polo shirt down around his paunchy middle, then grabbed his plaid cargo shorts and fished out a cigarette, his fifth since he'd stormed out of the motel. Lighting up, he hitched the shorts up over his wet swimsuit, stepped into his flip-flops, and slung the towel on his shoulder. He allowed himself a last slow, grateful look at the beach, the ocean, the sky, then shrugged, thinking, "Come on, you're the grown-up. Find your way back to that good feeling." The team of Dad and Jace. He headed over to Seward Avenue and east toward the motel. The team of Dad and Jace, the real Jace, not a misty sepia memory of a guileless 10-year-old. He needed to truly see and engage the mercurial kid Jace was now, someone who could in a blink morph from a brooding boy into a cocky, wisecracking, even charismatic young man, then back into a sullen wimp or an angry jerk or maybe just a spacey, confused 14-year-old. Time to take on the whole enchilada, this complex, contrary person slogging through the mud of his adolescence. Yes, he missed Jace terribly, missed him with the same aching sadness he'd felt in his drab, smoky apartment these past few months. 5 months, to put a number on it, in a gray, wet town 1,000 miles from his only child, collecting unemployment and looking for work until he'd finally settled on a low-level job selling residential solar energy with vague promises, bonuses, and rapid advancement from the bubbly, baby-faced owner. Then in early August, he'd been on the phone with Jace, one of those aimless, halting conversations full of silences and brief grunts or one-word answers to his questions, and Jace had actually strung a couple sentences together about, well, he didn't remember what about, but he detected something in the boy's voice, not just the deeper, crackly tone, no. The rhythm of his talking, the syntax even, had altered, and he knew his son had gone through yet another shift in his growing up, had entered a new phase, and he, Martin, hadn't been around for it. The next morning, he walked into the boss's office and asked for a week off. The man's mobile face flashed its wide, compelling grin as he told Martin that he'd need to put in a few more months before taking off that much time, then began enumerating targets and benchmarks that had to be achieved before the holiday season. But summer was ending. This might be Martin's last chance to get some time alone with Jace, the new Jace, before he transformed into yet another version of his mutating self. He surveyed the nattily-dressed gym-trim entrepreneur in front of him and reassessed. No, he didn't like the man or his bullshit promises, and the job was beneath him in any way. And besides, he'd already called Adrienne and hatched a plan and bought a plane ticket. He turned and walked out while the guy was still talking. As he crossed the parking strip that fronted the long motel building, he heard music, not the TV, coming from their room, and took it as a good sign. Maybe the kid was no longer collapsed in front of that stupefying sink of passivity. He stopped and listened. It wasn't the throbbing hip-hop that Jace usually played, but rather some sort of upbeat country rock with lyrics about drinking and fighting on Saturday night and going to church on Sunday morning. He reached in his pocket for the key, but it wasn't there. He checked his other pockets, but a whisper of a memory told him that he'd set it down when he'd gone in to get his suit and towel, then forgotten to retrieve it on the way out, distracted as he was by Jace's defiance and his own foul mood. He knocked. No response. He tried the door, then knocked harder. He wasn't quite sure, but the music seemed to get a bit louder. He thought he heard talking voices. He waited several seconds, then pounded, shouting his son's name. Nothing. The movement of a curtain in the room next door, the office and living quarters of Dave, the manager, caught his eye, and he looked over to see Dave's doughy, dour face with its small blue eyes and a nose that had been in one too many fist fights. A voice just behind his own door spoke quietly but clearly. "What do you want?" It was Jace. Martin spoke calmly, firmly. "Open the door." "Not now." The boy's voice was young and whiny. There was the sound of another deeper male voice, farther away and garbled, and Martin figured Dave's son Willie was in there. Jace mumbled something back, also indecipherable. "Open it, Jace." "Come back later." This time his son's voice was louder, more emphatic. He stepped back and surveyed the drab, yellowish oblong that was the Vagabond Motor Hotel. Should be easy to get around to the back, where he could at least get some sort of view through the sliding glass door. He might even have left it unlocked. He headed to the right, past the manager's room and down to the nearer end of the building. A narrow driveway ran between the back of the building and a rusted chain-link fence that marked the motel's property line. Beyond the fence was a quiet residential street. Each of the motel rooms had a tiny patio area with a little table and 2 chairs, all made of dark green plastic. The patios were flanked on the sides by neglected juniper hedges, about 3 feet high and 4 or 5 feet long, with 2 large plant pots on the back of each, marking where the concrete patio ended and the asphalt drive began. The potted plants were all scraggly geraniums, most of them dead or close to it. He recognized his own room by the big striped towel that hung on one of the patio chairs, with Jace's baggy swim trunks, black with splotches of bright colors, draped over it. Stepping into the patio area, he dropped his own towel on the empty chair and walked up to the sliding glass door. A girl no older than 15 or 16 sat smoking at the butcher block table in the tiny kitchen. There were 2 beers and a full 6-pack on the table. He looked through the doorless archway into the larger living area beyond the kitchen. He could see the foot ends of the 2 beds and the front door with a lamp table to one side, but not Jace or Willie, who must have been somewhere to the right or left of the archway. He looked again at the girl, and now he noticed that she was wearing only a scarlet lace bra and tight cut-off denim shorts. He realized that what, in his initial glance, he'd perceived as clothing was in fact a mural of tattoos on her neck, shoulders, and torso, and around her wrists and ankles. Except for the ones on her shoulders, which seemed to be crawling with colorful insects and reptiles, all of them were words, not single words, but phrases, sentences, even paragraphs. What he could see of her chest looked like a text of more than one sentence. Seemed like a text of more than one sentence in a script small enough that he'd need to get closer to read it. The various phrases there and on the rest of her body seemed to alternate between black and red ink, reminding Martin of his father's tattered copy of the New Testament in which Jesus' words were printed in red. The girl had thin lips and a snub nose, but large, heavily made-up green eyes that seemed to come forward from her face. She stared back at him, as if he were one of the dead plants on the edge of the patio. Willie appeared in the archway and said something to the girl. She gestured casually toward Martin. Willie did a barely perceptible double take, then sauntered over to the door, looked down at the handle, and flipped the latch lever. He then went over to the table, sat with his back to Martin, and opened a beer. Martin tried the door, but it wouldn't budge, and it dawned on him that Willie had just locked him out. Jace entered, and, spotting his father, froze. Their eyes locked, and the helpless panic of a startled young child filled his face. Martin tried to smile. Jace's mouth dropped into a pout, and he turned around and walked out. Willie laughed and called out something to Jace, who reappeared in the doorway. He He looked at his father almost coyly, then mumbled something to Willie, who laughed again. Jace continued to talk to Willie, with occasional nervous glances at his father. Finally, Martin stepped closer to the door and knocked. When Jace looked over at him, he gave a good-humored shrug and gestured to the door latch. A sober expression took hold of Jace's face, and he mumbled something to Willie, who shrugged and mumbled something back. Now the girl said something, and the boys responded at the same time loudly, though Martin couldn't make out their words. The girl stood, doused her cigarette in a coffee cup, and walked up to the door. Standing close to the glass and looking Martin in the eye, she grabbed her breasts with both hands and squeezed them together and upwards in an awkward and unsexy version of a gesture of an erotic dancer would make. Martin, not quite believing what he was seeing, looked past the girl, expecting to see the boys having a laugh at his expense, but in fact, they were chatting quietly as though nothing unusual was happening. An uncomfortable disorientation took hold of Martin's spine, and then a calm, familiar voice in his head told him he should be afraid. The girl's face was still frozen in the same blank expression, and now she turned her gaze down to her chest, again in a stiff, unerotic mime of what a stripper might do. She continued looking at her breasts until it occurred to Martin that she might in fact be reading them. With a familiar adolescent feeling of embarrassment, he looked hard at her chest, trying to make out the words. Apparently in response, the girl pushed her breasts against the glass, flattening them so that the words now seemed to be printed on a sign or the page of a book. He took out his reading glasses from a pocket in his shorts and, putting them on, bent closer to see what her breasts had to say. And he said unto her, Daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace, and be whole of thy plague. While yet he spake, the words were cut off by the top of her bra. He heard voices behind him and turned around quickly to see a middle-aged couple walking along the sidewalk on the other side of the chain-link fence. The woman, who obviously had seen him staring at the girl's breasts, laughed noisily, then grabbed her own droopy tits and shook them at her partner. She wore a longish gray skirt and a yellow cardigan sweater, and her modest matronly demeanor made the gesture seem all the more incongruous. The man, walking on the far side of the woman, smiled faintly and said something to her, and she laughed again. As they continued up the street, Martin watched the man for a moment. He was heavy-set and moved as though he suffered some sort of chronic joint pain. Martin looked at his gray hair cut in a retro flat top and new jeans with the cuffs rolled up, and decided he was one of those dorky middle-aged guys who ride fancy new Harleys in weekend motorcycle clubs. More annoyed than embarrassed, he turned back to the door, where the girl still stood in front of him, though no longer against the glass. He leaned to one side and looked in over her shoulder. Willie was passing a lit pipe to Jace, who took a deep toke and handed it back. For a moment, Martin was mesmerized by their sheer brazenness, and he stood there, ignoring the girl, staring at two young teenagers behaving like jaded 20-something slackers. But he snapped out of it and knocked loudly on the glass. For the first time, the girl's face expressed some emotion, irritation mostly, and she turned and walked through the archway and into the bedroom area. Martin again heard the serene, avuncular voice in his head tell him he should be afraid. For some reason, he responded with a defiant smile, but when he went to knock on the glass door again, he found himself pounding furiously. A murderous anger directed fully at Jace took hold of him. It was like no anger he'd ever felt toward anyone before, except it occurred to him his own father. The boys regarded him with deadpan, uninterested stares. Jace said something to Willie, and they stood, slowly, calmly, grabbed the pipe and a little pouch of weed, and left the room. Martin felt the rage in his chest deform into a sickening feeling that seemed uglier and more dangerous in anger. It spread quickly through his torso and then his entire body, and he felt at once helpless and invincible. He turned and retraced his steps back around the front of the building. By the time he got there, he was moving at an awkward jog in his beach flip-flops. As he arrived at the door to the room, he tripped over something and almost tumbled, but just managed to catch himself, then felt a stinging pain in the big toe of his right foot. He looked down and saw that the toenail was broken in half and blood was oozing out. He willed himself to ignore it and started pounding on the door. He waited, pounded again. Silence. A quick movement of the curtain in Dave's window caught his eye, but by the time he looked over there, it had fallen shut. He stepped over the Dave's window and tried to peek through the crack where the curtains came together. He thought he saw Willie standing back a ways from the window, so he knocked loudly. There was a pause, and the curtains parted a bit further, and Willie's face appeared. He seemed to be leaning forward, his body bent at the waist, and Martin remembered seeing a desk by the window when he'd first stepped into Dave's dingy office. The boy looked at him curiously, as though he were peering into an animal crate. "Tell Jace to get out here now," Martin yelled. Willie smiled. "You tell him, big guy." "Jace." There was no reply. He could see someone moving behind Willie, and he pounded hard on the window. "Jace, get the fuck out here." He heard quiet laughter, no doubt coming from one of the boys. Again, a kind of wave washed through him, an alien force invading his body, making it powerful yet uncontrollable, and he thought, maybe this is what that inner voice was warning me about. And then he thought, I could just get in my big black SUV and drive it through the front door, through that fucking ticky-tacky wall, and he even turned toward the car, ready to do something absolutely beyond the pale insane. But a brick, sitting to one side of the motel door, caught his eye. It was obviously what he tripped on and must have been left there as a doorstop. He stared at it, feeling somehow persecuted and betrayed by this inanimate enemy. Then something inside his skull shifted, and the brick seemed to transform right there in front of him. And now he was the first apish humanoid looking at a random rock that was becoming, in a game-changing epiphany, a tool, something that could get him where he needed to go. As he smashed the window, holding onto the end of the brick and jabbing at the glass, he heard voices inside, several of them at once, in a kind of fanfare of emotions: surprise, amusement, anger, derision. And then the angry voice, deeper and more authoritative, took over, pushing the others into the background. Next thing, the door opened noisily, squeakily, and Dave, the manager, appeared. He stood half in and half out, leaning against the doorframe, looking directly at Martin with an expression of cold disgust. Martin, still holding the brick, looked at Dave, then back at the window. "Stopping by for a visit?" Dave asked. Martin shrugged. Dave walked back inside, leaving the door open. Martin followed. Except for the desk, which was now covered with broken glass, the room looked much like his own. Worn gold carpet, 2 beds separated by a round table against the right wall, wood grain cabinet holding a fat, old-fashioned television on the left wall, and an archway to the kitchen at the back. On the little table was an open pizza box with a single hardened slice covered with ham and pineapple. But just beyond the beds, in the wall that the room shared with the next room over, not Martin's room, but the one on the other side, was another door. It was open, and a man stood there in the doorway watching Martin. There was no sign of Willie or Jace. The man, big-boned and tall, with a squarish head and a short, thick neck, shifted the heft of his body from one foot to the other as his shoulders swiveled nervously, like a boxer preparing for a fight. "Does he know who he fucking with, Dave?" Dave was carefully collecting the glass shards in a pile on the desk and didn't respond to the man, who seemed to become more agitated. "Does he know?" "No. He doesn't know who he fucking with. He doesn't know anything. You got something to tell him?" "I don't. No, not me. So maybe you should be silent, right?" "Right, Dave." The man let out a quiet, nervous giggle. Dave turned back to Martin. "He was some kind of hero back in Desert Storm. Can you believe that? I wonder if he explained to the fucking Iraqis who they were fucking with." Martin looked at the other man and decided that yes, he did believe he'd fought in a war. He turned back to Dave. He's trying to intimidate me. You're the one holding the brick, cowboy. The other man laughed. That's right, Dave. Deadly weapon. Martin had forgotten about the brick. He put it down on the desk. I just want Jace. They came over here and I want them to come back. Dave turned towards the kitchen, but spoke quietly. Hey, Willie. Willie appeared in the doorway. He didn't look at Martin. Where's the kid? Dave asked. I don't know. Come on, Dave said, still speaking softly. What did you do with him? Do with him? You know what I'm asking. The girl appeared and stood next to Willie. She had put on a white sweatshirt. The green of her eyes seemed brighter and artificial like lime jello. Willie ignored her. He's not here, he said. I don't know where he went. The man looked at Martin with a bored, annoyed look. There you have it. For the first time, Martin felt fear, not for himself, but for Jace. He turned to Willie. But you were with him. What happened to him? Willie gave Martin his amused, dismissive stare. There was a brief silence until the girl spoke up. He might have gone to Mexico. Everybody looked at her. I mean, that's what he said. He's going to go hitchhike to Mexico and get a job at Walmart. Willie let out an explosive stone laugh. Shut up, Sabra. The kid was chewed. You don't need to repeat any of the greasy talking. They have Walmart in Mexico. My cousin serves our church ministry in this Mexican town, and his girlfriend's a cashier at Walmart. Martin felt a panic sweep through him, an acute sub-rational terror, as if he was the one who was stoned. Maybe Jace was in Mexico, or rather on his way there in some stranger's car. I have to find him, he said, looking at Dave desperately, as though the man might know how to go about searching for a boy on the lam. Dave sighed. 57 clams, he said. Martin stared, confused. That's what it's going to cost. That's not even counting the blood you're dripping on the carpet. Martin looked down. His toe was now covered with blood, some of which had dribbled on over the edge of his flip-flop and onto the carpet. He felt a pulsating, stinging ache. I got a glass guy. I know what he charges. That's a deal. He doesn't charge me for that. He comes over and does it on site. We're friends, so he'll stay and have a beer. He charges for labor and materials, period. $57. Martin found his wallet and handed Dave 3 20s. I locked myself out of my room. Can you let me back in? Dave gestured toward the brick on the desk. Let yourself in, cowboy. He threw Martin a brief menacing stare, then reached out and slapped his shoulder in a movement that was at once conciliatory and aggressive, letting out a forced chuckle. I'll grab the key. Dave unlocked Martin's door, then headed back over to his room without a word. Martin stepped inside. The air was heavy with a sweet, earthy reek of marijuana smoke, and he opened the window by the door. There was a low, chattery noise inside the room that seemed both exotic and ominous. He turned around quickly, but saw that it was the most commonplace of living room sounds, a ball game on TV. He realized that he was processing incoming sensory information very slowly. He let his eyes scan the room, his gaze stopping on an empty tequila bottle on the TV cabinet, and then on an area on the floor with a crumpled blanket, a pillow, and a glass on its side before arriving at the obvious destination. And sure enough, there was Jace on the nearer bed, slumped in an unnatural position, half sitting but twisted to the right, away from Martin, partially propped on his elbow, eyes shut. Martin sat down at the head of the bed with his back against the wall. He placed his hand on his son's chest to make contact to assure himself that the boy was breathing. Jace stirred, glanced at the TV, then abruptly sat up straight, looking alarmed and disoriented the way he had as a young child in the grip of a night terror. Back then, he would, several times a week, around midnight, suddenly scream or begin mumbling loudly, often sitting up in bed and continuing to chatter, sometimes even standing and behaving as though he had to get somewhere urgently, until Martin or Adrienne managed to get him back into bed and normal sleep. He was never fully awake during these episodes, always in some altered liminal fugue state. He never remembered any of it later, not even the faintest sense of having dreamt or slept badly. Now he stared strangely at the TV, as if wondering what in the world it was, then exhaled a long sigh that seemed full of heartbreaking disappointment. He slumped back down, this time on his left side, his head falling on Martin's lap, but with no acknowledgement of his father, and Martin felt himself half disappear, as he often did with Jace. At such times he was convinced that he was to Jace not so much another person as an implicit presence, a kind of spirit that imbued the room with familiarity, with safety. Martin arranged himself so that Jace's head rested on his thigh, and the boy snuggled in and returned to his deep slumber, breathing a quiet, soothing snore. He squeezed his son's shoulder, then rested his hand on the boy's hip. Beyond Jace's head, he could see his own bloodied toe, a darker, dirtier red now. The pain had subsided to a dull, reassuring throb. On the TV, two teams he didn't care about were tied in the 7th inning. He heard Dave's angry voice coming through the wall behind him, then Willie's, sounding high-pitched and plaintive, like a much younger boy's. A door slammed. Wafts of a sea breeze slipped in through the window, carrying the distinctive beach smell of things dead and alive. On a hill in Pasadena was an elegant craftsman house to which he would soon be delivering his only child. On the north side of Portland was an apartment in which he'd be spending too much time, wading through online job listings, praying he wouldn't run out of money. Here they were in a crummy motel room in Ventura, a struggling father and his difficult, lovely boy, and he wanted time to stop at this unhappy hour before he lost even more.
Hi, my name is Paisley Rekdal, and I was the judge for this year's poetry writing contest, and it was my honor and pleasure to have chosen the poems by Maria Isabelle Carlos from her packet of poems called Meditations on the Barely Spoken. One of the things that I love about these poems, they are long, they're long, they're capacious, they're just incredibly ambitious. They take into consideration history, family, race, environment. They move through time. They include all sorts of details and anecdotes, and also great meditations on history itself. These are incredibly ambitious poems that never lose their momentum, never lose their focus, which is really hard to do, especially over a 2 to 3 page poem. I never ever got bored reading these poems at all, and I just thought this is an incredibly assured, confident voice, and it was a delight to read them, as it was a delight to read all of the entries for this year's contest. So congratulations to Maria. Please go out, and if you can find her poems anywhere, get them, because they are remarkable. I'd like to read a couple of poems from my newest book, Nightingale. Nightingale is a book of poetry that reimagines Ovid's Metamorphoses. For those of you who know, Ovid took all of the Greek and Roman myths and sort of wove them together to tell the story in his own words of the creation of the universe, the beginning and creation of Rome, moral philosophy, every single story you could possibly imagine about the gods and goddesses. But when I went back to it, one of the things that really struck me was that it was also a story about art and trauma and silence. And one of the things that happens over and over and over in the book is that people are hurt or wounded, sometimes raped, and oftentimes they turn to art in order to depict their suffering. In this poem, I rewrite the story of Philomela. In Ovid's version, Philomela is a young woman who has been raped by her brother-in-law, and he cuts out her tongue so she can't tell anyone. She decides to weave a tapestry, and then she gives this tapestry to her sister. The tapestry, of course, depicts everything that her brother-in-law did. Then the two of them go on a rampage for revenge, and they kill and dismember and do a whole bunch of awful things. But I decide to revisit this story in a more contemporary setting, and maybe a different way of thinking about the relationship between art and trauma. Philomela. Because her grandmother loved the arts, her father said, she'd willed the money to a distant cousin working as a sculptor. a decision made the month before she died from cancer, which the young woman cannot now believe was due only to a brain tumor, having endured the last deliberate ways her grandmother asked why she'd never married. The cousin who inherited the money showed her sculptures in a converted barn, the only space large enough to contain the seething shapes that seemed to flame up from their pedestals in precarious arcs. An audacity of engineering the young woman tried not to see as a reproach when, curious, she visited. How the sculptures made her feel too earthbound, solid. At the gallery, she stared a long while at what she thought was a tree blasted by lightning. But the more she looked, the more clearly shapes emerged. There were a man's hands gripping a slender figure by the waist, the thin body writhing, frozen in his arms. It was a girl she saw, with shredded bark for breasts and dark, charred wood for legs, as if the limbs had been snatched from a fire while burning. Her twig hands raked her captor's face. The young woman could read no emotion on it, however. The plank face had been scraped clean. All the fear and anger burned instead inside their twisting bodies. She could see the two there stuck at a point of perfect hatred for each other. She for his attack, he for her resistance. Perhaps the beauty he could not stand in her, as her last date in college had hissed. "You think you're so fucking pretty," spitting it into her face so that she'd had to turn her cheek to wipe it, which was when he grabbed her arm, pinning her. Was this why her cousin had been chosen? To make what she'd had no words for? Persephone, the piece she stood amazed before, had been titled the last, perhaps unconscious gift of her grandmother. "For your wedding," she'd said during her last week, pointing to her own open palm in which nothing rested. Perhaps her grandmother had imagined a gold ring there, perhaps a string of thick pink pearls. The young woman drove home from the gallery, took a shower, and did not tell anyone that day what it was she'd seen. A month later, in the mail, a package came from her father, her grandmother's Singer sewing machine, its antique brass wheels scrubbed of gold, the wooden handle glossy with vines of mother of pearl. It was lovely, and for a moment she considered sewing a quilt with it onto which she might embroider shooting stars in red and saffron, the figure of a child perhaps, or of a man by a house's courtyard, his hat in his hands, his broad body naked, harmless. How much thread would that take to make, she wondered, and considered it a long while before packing up the machine again, sliding it back into its wood crate and high up onto a shelf of her bedroom closet, the place she kept some books, old clothes, and college papers, where she told herself it could wait. And the last poem I'm going to read is another poem that considers change. And one of the things that we tend to think about is how we are changed externally in these ways, but of course we're changed internally too. Driving to Santa Fe. Quick swim up through the headlights, gold eye, a startle and black, green, swift glance raking mine. A full second, we held each other, gone, gone. And how did I know what to call it? Lynx, the only possible reply, though I'd never seen one. The car filling with it, moonlight, pinion, a cat's acrid smell of terror. How quickly the gray body fled, swerving to avoid my light. And how often that sight returns to me, shames me to know how much more this fragment matters, more than the broad back of a man I loved, more than the image of my friend cancer-struck, curled beside her toilet, more than my regret for the child I did not have, which I thought once would pierce me utterly. Nothing beside that dense muscle, faint gold guard hairs stirring the dark. And if I keep these scraps of it, what did it keep of me? A flight, a thunder. A shield of light dropped before the eyes, pinned inside that magnificent skull only time would release, split back, fade, and reveal. Wind would open him, sun would turn him commonplace, a knot of flies, a rib cage of shredded tendon, wasp nest, fragile. The treasure of him, like anything, gone. Even now, I thumb that face like a coin I cannot spend. If something in me ever lived, it lived in him, fishing the cold, trout-thick streams, waking to snow, dying when he died, which is a comfort. I must say this, otherwise I myself do not exist. It looked at me a moment, a flash of green, of gold and white. Then the dark came down again between us. Once I was afraid of being changed. Now that is finished. The lynx has me in its eye. I am already diminished. Thank you so much, and congratulations again to Maria, and everyone enjoy the festival. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Isabelle Carlos, and I am a writer from Columbia, Missouri, currently living in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm going to read a selection of poems called Meditations on the Barely Spoken, and I'm so grateful to the readers at the Tennessee Williams New Orleans Literary Festival, and of course the final judge, Paisley Rekdal, for choosing my poems as winner of the poetry contest. The first poem in my selection is called Exploded View, and fair warning, there is a little bit of profanity. Exploded View. A decade later, I still speed through familiar curves, let up on the gas as I approach each turn, then accelerate around the bend, the orchestral pit of summer crickets filling my car with the sound of their wings, tuning. No speed traps this far north of town, this deep into the farmlands, where hills swell like high tides and spill open to fields of baled hay and cattle, where the road twists through trees crowding close enough to touch from my window, where deer watch from the wood's dark passages and lift their crowned heads with mild curiosity. On my left, the old brick house comes into view, quarter mile from the road, down the gravel driveway. I turn in, past the pear trees, past Pop's ancient S10 collecting bird nests in the cab, past the neighbor's double wide just beyond the fence. Wild-haired Mr. Martin, what's left of his teeth yellow and slimy from meth and chewing tobacco. Mr. Martin, who'd bathe outside buck naked every day when I'd come home from school, as if he waited for the bus to trundle along and for me to march up the long driveway alone, staring forward while he dumped buckets of soapy water over himself, suds clustering around his pale, droopy penis. Once he said, "Come here, girl," cackled as I sped into a run. One day I walked a beer down to Pop while he finished mowing. He killed the engine, stomped down from his beat-up tractor, face and neck reddening like rhubarb roots. The bottle sweated down my knuckles as I stood statue in the yard while he beelined to the fence, bellowing curses in 2 languages at Mr. Martin, who'd taken a bucket of dog crap, swimming in stale bathwater, and tipped the sludge over our fence on Pop's freshly mowed grass. Another string of expletives, pointing down, pointing at. I heard my father warn, "I'm not just some who'll sit down and let you walk all over me." And I didn't know what to make of that. This ranking he invoked, with his machismo strut and thick machinist forearms, some upper echelon of lesser color, divisions within the model minority. After that, Mr. Martin quit bathing outside, quit bogging our yard with his shit water, and so I was grateful. And that double wide is empty now. Sometime in the 10 years since, he fucked off somewhere or died. I've never cared to find out. And today, as I inch up the driveway, I see my Pop on the front porch, a bud heavy in one hand and a greasy rag in the other. The garage is open, yawning, and already I catch faint whiffs of gasoline and engine exhaust, see bent nails and stripped bolts rusting in a coffee can, extension cords strung up like industrial vines, manuals stacked and dog-eared at exploded view diagrams of an engine's interlocking parts. What would I gather from a schematic of my father, his various mechanisms suspended in relation to each other? A son, a brother, uprooted across an ocean. Steel-toed work boots stinking up the house, palms like stiff leather, grease-caked cuticles, old man who built a life with the junkyard scraps he was given. He wraps an arm around my shoulders when I step out of the car, asks when I last changed the oil, kisses my forehead, and inhales the smell of my hair, as if I am the good, clean air he's been waiting ages to breathe. I lean into him and listen for pistons churning a rusted crankshaft in his chest, where black electric tape braids his spine together, where some coagulated muck is gumming up the works, residue of a solution for survival that we never got around to mopping up. This next poem in the selection is called 1999. And the only thing you need to know about it is that kuya in Tagalog is a term of respect and endearment for one's older brother. 1999. It was the year of false flowers and decorative fruit arranged on the shelf at the end of the hall above a wood-framed mirror, waxy stems and painted polyester petals. Year I plucked plastic grapes and chewed them, dusty violet bulbs squeaking between my teeth, before suctioning them to the glass where they left little pocked kiss marks. It was the year every mirror in the house was added to my list of daily chores. The year Kuya, old enough to obsess over Candyman, locked me in the bathroom, whispered the name 5 times through the crack beneath the door. Year I wiped every mirror in the house with my eyes shut tight. Year of Pokemon collections displayed in zip-up 5-star binders, their holographic shimmer in plastic sheaths. Year of little auctioneers trading cards at recess beneath a set of monkey bars that spindled through the air and touched back down like an arced spider's web, a metal-worked turtle shell. Year Jordan Jones packed a pistol in his backpack and showed it off at morning recess. Year he was gone by lunchtime. It is 2020, and I haven't seen Jordan Jones until today, when his name surfaced in my mind like something dislodged from the bottom of a lake and floating toward the light. I looked him up, blonde hair shaved to a whisper from his scalp, a woman and a little girl in a few of the cover photos, then just the girl, then no girl. Education, Missouri Eastern Correctional Center. Bio, if it ain't white, it ain't right. He's maybe 16 in his earliest profile picture. The camera lens captured him slantwise, candid. He's looking up, cigarette smoke threading from his mouth, hands gripping a video game controller, bearing that same heavy-lidded glare. Irises, a shock of green in the photo's flash. It was 1999 when Mrs. Henry, our teacher, did not try to hide her snot bubble nose, chafed raw from the bathroom's single-ply toilet tissue. For that was the year of Columbine, of metal detectors, of Manson, of blue hair and black nail panic. It was the year Jordan wore the same shirt every day, when he lived in the house at the edge of the neighborhood with broken yellow shutters half hung to the window frames. Year he stole his dad's unloaded gun and was expelled. Year of a beating so bad we heard it down the block. It was 1999, and we still had phone books then. I stacked them on a chair, pushed my makeshift stepladder to the hall closet, shoved blankets and empty shoeboxes, and found Pop's pistol in the farthest corner, tucked into a leather holster. In 1999, I learned it was heavier than I'd imagined and cold, and that I couldn't see the bullets, even when I investigated its hollow throat with one keen open eye. And that when I shook it back and forth, nothing rattled or sloshed around, and that if I put both pointer fingers on the trigger and pulled, it wouldn't shoot because it was 1999, and I hadn't yet learned how to switch the safety off. I gripped it like they did in the movies, wrapped both hands around the base and swiveled around, teetering on the phone books. I pointed the barrel down the hall to the wood-framed mirror, squinted over the notched sights, and aimed at the girl glaring back. Crooked bangs splayed across her forehead, toes curled around the yellow pages. I said, "Candyman, Candyman, Candyman," and flicked my wrists to tip the muzzle up. Feigned the gun's sharp kick as each syllable shot from my lips. "Bang," I said. "Bang, bang. You're dead. And you, and you." There's two more poems. This next one is dedicated to a community of friends and writers that I met in the summer of 2019 at the Minnesota Northwoods Writers Conference. At the informal participants' reading, I am drawn to the way language lights off her tongue and hers, to the sheer skin enveloping pink muscled lips that stretch and fold and collapse around each syllable, hers tinted coral, theirs magenta, others fuchsia or chapsticked or bare. I am drawn to the meticulous pause she basks in, a slight part and sip of breath, moisture dewing the corners of her mouth, a duo of pinholed light. Around our long oval table, set with popcorn, dark chocolate, cool cans of seltzer, one woman passes a silver flask, one crosses her legs in a cushioned chair and balances her notebook where her shins touch. The circle stills. The circle braces, the circle sighs its collective sigh and gives praises and repeats phrases that echo, that won't loosen their grip. "Thank you," we say. Knowing thank you is not enough. Sunlight ripens through the wall of windows, casts warm angles that crane across the carpet and illuminate the dust. This hour is an estuary. All shadows flood into one saltwater dark, and I find our faces in the glass perfect and glowing, and it's as if we've breached a liminal life, a marginal coast, where we mother and sister and daughter each other. We rise to meet our barest selves, our barely spoken selves. This last poem is dedicated to my high school AP English teacher. She passed away in October of 2018. So this poem is an elegy for her. And the only other thing you need to know, I think, is that it uses a line. It's the epitaph on John Keats's gravestone. Here lies one whose name was writ in water, was the original line. Elegy for Diana Liskam. Already I'm losing track. Memories receding like the perfect word that skirts the mouth and fades. Like the rot sweet leaves falling from a maple tree where, beneath its spangled canopy, a woman slows and tips her head back, looks up as if to listen. And for a second, from the opposite street corner where I stand, savoring the smell of rain-wet earth and decomposing foliage, I mistake her for you. Pale gold hair curling toward her chin, black petticoat, leather purse slung over a shoulder, papers flaring out. She adjusts her bag and resumes walking, heading to her car, perhaps, or her office, oblivious to the false relief she'd given me, to the renewed grief spreading in my chest like a web of hoarfrost. I conjure you from memory on my walk home, remembering when I was 17 and you'd slowed by my desk, head tilted down, eyes fixed where my textbook should have been. Instead, Bishop's complete poems. How I turned red and shrank into the desk chair, fearing you'd scold, confiscate the book until the end of class. I'm 29 and looking for you beneath an orange maple, its chattering leaves bright as molten glass. I swallow your name like bitter medicine and walk home, where I pull Rilke's letters down from the shelf, snug between Rich and Ruthke, and open to the page where you'd signed, trace the swooping curves as if I can summon you. Someday, I'll visit your grave, return the book you slid down the bar, saying I needed it more than you. Here lies one whose name was writ in Rilke. Already, I'm losing track. Memories, a day crescendo of ripples flattening into the smooth glass of a dark pond. I'm 21, and you're ordering my first Chardonnay, saying one day I'll grow into the good dark reds. I'm 24, and you're waving from a table at a busy restaurant, hair short, face plump, the medication rounding your cheeks, you tell me, while I stare up at fluorescent light fixtures, as if their hum and pulse were prayer, willing my eyes to dry. A woman slows beneath a hot, bright tree, and I wonder what poem you turned to that day you lifted Bishop from my desk and nodded. You nod from across the table in the bustling restaurant while I shake my head in anger as you tell me about the tumor, the bully in your brain, its tenacity. I look for you beneath a tree whose leaves shock the gray-blue sky with citrus, and you lay the book back down on my desk, as if to say, proceed, as if to say, carry on. Thank you so much for listening.
I am T. Jacobson. I'm the writing contest coordinator for the festival. And we are here with Leigh Camacho Rourks, who it was our very short fiction judge this year. And we're pleased to have her here with us. Leigh is, Dr. Rourkes is an assistant professor of English at Beacon College in Central Florida. And her debut short story collection, Moon Trees and Other Orphans, won the St. Lawrence Book Award, and Leigh was very gracious enough to agree to be our very short fiction judge this year. And she chose, the winning entry was Whenever You Cross the Michigan Avenue Bridge by Amy Fitzgerald of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Welcome, Leigh. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I love the Tennessee Williams Festival. I love that even though I can't be there, I'm there. So it's really great.
We all miss being here in person. Let's talk a little bit about the contest and how you got to judge many entries. The very short fiction contest this year, we had a record number of submissions. So it was a very difficult job this year. What do you look for in a short story? What sparks for you about a story?
So with the very short fiction, this flash modality, I'm really looking for something that's using the very special form that this is to its greatest advantages. You know, it is so sparse. The rigidness of word count is so tight that you can't meander, you can't build a story in the same way. And so what's the trade-off there? Well, the trade-off is we can get really exciting moments. We can get really exciting glimpses. We can venture into writing that may not work in a longer form. We can experiment a lot. So the confines of the very short fiction of 1,000 words or less actually opens the doors for a lot of imaginative play. And so that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for someone doing something really exciting and interesting in a short space, something that explodes, really.
What did you like about Amy's piece?
Amy's piece is filled with action. It is so short that she's really focused into, hold on one second. Do we know Amy's pronouns?
I'm almost positive she's she, her, simply because the emails back and forth I've been getting from her.
Okay.
She's
All right. So I'll start that over again. I just didn't want to misgender anyone. All right. What I really love about Amy's piece is how explosive it is. It is filled with energy, and she's used that short form to zero in on such a small period of time in a person's life that is somehow also filled with movement. There is this runner and doing something sort of scary and interesting, and we just get seconds with this person. So the form is letting us zero in. Amy is also using a lot of lists and a lot of really kind of long sentences that creates this rush of motion. It has momentum in almost every second of it. It's a hard form to get that in, and so that was really exciting for me. Additionally, I don't expect writing to be perfect. I expect it to be dynamic, and it really is a dynamic piece. Amy chose second person to work in, which is always a little scary, and it's always a little interesting, and it's really hard to make work. And yet what Amy has done is put us right into this adventurous but also frightened person's mind as they run and run. And that's exciting to me. How do you do that? So it was really a lot of fun to read and reread. I just reread it just now, and I really had a good time. And that's what I like in fiction. I'm here to be transported, and it definitely transported me.
Let's talk a little bit about the genre itself. Very short fiction is kind of becoming this very popular category to read right now. And particularly with pandemic conditions, a lot of people are reading a lot more again. What is it about very short fiction that appeals to such an audience? What do you think it is?
I think the easy answer is our attention spans are a little short, and very short fiction is something we can all read any time. If I'm sitting in a doctor's office and I'm waiting, I can log into my favorite flash fiction journals and read a couple of pieces and really escape that moment that I don't really enjoy, and fully enjoy a story. So there's the attention span thing. There is the time investment, but it's also really easy to reread, to come back to and examine because it's shorter. I also just think that there's a lot of cutting edge experimentation being done in flash fiction. It feels exciting. It feels fresh. I don't read the same story over and over again in flash fiction. I'm always surprised. And that's really exciting, I think, for all of us, especially right now where some of us, myself included, I don't leave the house right now because of the pandemic, because of my health. And having a little bit of wonder in my life, and flash fiction really leans itself towards wonder, has been very nice. Sometimes it's scary, sometimes it's strange, sometimes it's hopeful, sometimes it's sad, but there are these moments in time that only require me to delve in for a little bit, but that I can return to over and over again and feel like I'm outside of these walls. So that's what it is for me. And I think it's got to be similar for other people.
It's definitely one of my favorite categories to read, one of my favorite forms, simply because I do have a short attention span. So it's nice to be able to read good, tight writing and do it quickly, and I can read a whole story in moments.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to talk a little bit about your book because Moon Trees and Other Orphans, I was blown away by. It made me actually stop, just go, wow, that was powerful writing. One of the things I loved best about your work is that it's very lyrical. Do you think being, writing poetry and writing other genres helps you to be a better very short fiction writer?
Absolutely. I started in poetry. I studied under Jack Bedell, who was our Poet Laureate for a while and teaches over at Southeastern. He's my mentor, he's my friend. And I started in poetry, and but I'm sort of a natural storyteller. I'd rather tell you a yarn. There's my Louisiana coming out. I might be in Florida, but it's still in me. And and so it was really, I was already writing narrative poetry, and then I wanted to practice a little bit out of genre, and I fell in love with fiction. But the line and the ear, those things that are so important in poetry, living not just on the page but in the ear, those are values I bring to my fiction. And so I do think it helps. It's also just really great for me to work in multiple genres, because if I'm stuck in one genre, it is very freeing to write in another one. So lately I've started poetry again because it's been hard during the pandemic for me to connect with fiction. But I've been feeling maybe a little more lyrical. So I've been writing a lot more poetry. And occasionally I write creative nonfiction. And I think that when I move from genre to genre, I use the tools of those genres, but I get to use them in brand new ways, which is lights up my brain, reinvigorates my creativity. So I definitely think that those other genres help me with my fiction, not just on the lyrical level, but because they invigorate me.
Would you please read from your book for us?
I would love to. So this is Moon Trees and Other Orphans, with our little controversial cover there. And I was going to read two pieces of very short fiction, flash fiction. The first one is called Elma. Elma set her cigarette on the edge of the soap dish. She examined her thinning hairline in the mirror, examined her ears, left eye, right, lifted each breast, ran her fingers across the skin her husband loved to nuzzle before his death. She put the cigarette back in her mouth and sat bare-assed on the commode to check her feet between her toes. There was a tick somewhere. Or bedbugs, lice, botflies, fleas, mites, scabies. She itched, not just her skin, her brain. The sharp fiberglass splinters of last night's television, parasites, monsters on your skin, lodged there, pricking. She knew it was the show driving her nuts. The new nurse had put it on. Do you mind? She liked the girl, never in a hurry. Elma'd learned to ask about their days, to offer tea, to keep new ailments to herself, or they'd nurse up the whole night. On her inspection, she skipped the painful area behind her knee, the one she'd been ignoring, keeping quiet about. That patch, sore to the touch for a month at least, wriggled and writhed, but she didn't look. Instead, she scrubbed ticks from her hair, mites from her breasts, scabies off her skin. Even when she nicked the spot with her nail and the beetles tumbled out, again, their hard carapaces clicking against the tile floor, the last one catching, pinching on the way out of the wound. Even then, she kept flicking her hair, fingering her scalp, searching, never looking down. So that was Elma. And this is something entirely different and maybe more in line with the rest of the book. It's called At the Very End. The cigarette is very, very small in Uncle's hands, the burning ash a bright bit of fairy light in the afternoon gloom. He is the biggest man in the family, biggest in the parish, maybe all Louisiana. but not the biggest in the world. That one is in Turkey, and he beats Uncle by less than half a foot. We are in a farm graveyard with simple above ground slabs decorated with plastic flowers tipped by shifting winds. The plots are too small for Uncle. They are more my size, which is good. It is the sort of private cemetery you find in rural areas. The road we followed was just gravel and then was not road at all, only ruts. Shallow earth peppered with grass shoots. The farmland that surrounds us is grown over, given to goats and then to cattle. It's quiet, he says, and I nod. It'd be stupid to think that this place is empty, that the broken trailers sinking into soft mud across the way are abandoned. Where there is land, there is people. But no one peeks out of bent door frames to see what we want. I'm small the way Uncle is big, and I'm dying. Not tonight, not here with Uncle in this graveyard in front of these poor farmlands and bleating goats, but soon enough. Uncle puts his hand on my face, and it is as if I am a moon in a fairy tale, cupped by a giant playing at making a sky. I watch the brilliant ashes teeter in his other hand. I climb on one of the slabs. There are trees to see and buttercups and rusted farm supplies. I've wanted this sort of above ground grave, this simple slab, for as long as I've known. Wanted to forever in a field like this instead of the big church cemetery my mother bought a plot in. Here, I say, more powerful than I have felt in my whole life. And Uncle, the only one that understands, nods, looks for a door to knock on, a person to make a deal with. And that was at the very end.
Thank you, Leigh. That was absolutely wonderful. I want to ask you one follow-up question that because you are a teacher, what is the best piece of writing advice you've ever received? And what is the worst piece of writing advice?
The best piece of writing advice I think that I've gotten is the one we've probably all heard, but maybe don't listen to completely, and that's read widely and read a lot of different things, even things that may not be 100% your thing. Now, I'm not one of those people who finishes every single book, whether I like it or not, but I do think that reading outside of my personal genres, connecting with different types of writing has helped me as a writer more than anything else. The worst piece of writing advice I have gotten and that I've heard is that if you don't write every day, you will never be a writer. I just can't write every day. I have a full-time job. I have, a life that I have to give part of myself to, and I need experiences to fuel my writing. I need to be out there doing things. And so I write most days. I write most weeks. I think that anytime we tell someone that unless they have the privilege of carving out several hours every day, they cannot do something, we're just shutting down a whole group of people out there. And so I would say that's kind of bad advice. I do think you have to write to be a writer, and you have to write often, but you're going to have to figure out where to carve out your own space. Nobody else can tell you how to do that.
That is wonderful advice, and I certainly appreciate it because I can't write every day either. So that's wonderful to hear. Since most of us, and like you said, most of us are told to read and read widely, what are you reading right now?
Well, what am I reading right now? I'm reading a couple of different things. I'm trying to remember. Okay, so I just got this. So I've just read like a page of it, but this is Motherland and Other Stories by Wandika Gale. I actually went to school with Wandika. She's an amazing writer, and it's a beautiful book. I also just got my poetry, Color All Maps New. I'm plugging Jack Bedell again, but this is what's on my desk right now that I'm kind of reading in between things. And then I am in a reading group that does a podcast, and we are about to start reading some Hemingway. So
Wow.
reading a few different things.
Leigh, thank you so much. On behalf of the festival, thank you for putting up with me this year. All the thousands of emails back and forth that we've had. Thank you so much for being our judge, because it has been an absolute joy and pleasure.
It has been an incredible honor. I'm so glad I got to meet you. I'm so glad I got to be a part of the festival this year. I'm so glad that I got to judge. I can't thank you enough.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Fitzgerald in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'm going to read a story I wrote that won this year's Tennessee Williams and New Orleans Literary Festival's very short fiction contest. First, I want to say thank you to everyone involved with the festival, including Teresa Jacobson for coordinating all of this, and Leigh Camacho Rourks, who judged this contest. This is Whenever You Cross the Michigan Avenue Bridge. You always run, in case it opens up beneath you, splits in two so that each half can hinge up and let boats pass through on the river. You know, don't you, that it won't open without warning? That there are bridge tenders stationed in the towers at either end all day, that it'll be blocked off and cleared of pedestrians and vehicles well before the steel leaves begin their upward swing. You know that this bridge has been here nearly 3 decades, since 1920, and it's been opened thousands of times each of those years, and not once has somebody been caught in the middle. Not once has a young white lady like you, a smartly dressed and carefully coiffed secretary, the daughter of clenched-jawed Polish immigrants who taught their children to never complain, at least not to them, been trapped on this bridge in the heart of Chicago with gravity turning against her. Yet you can't help picturing your half of the bridge tilting, spilling you along its surface, denying you a handhold, somehow managing to pitch you off it entirely and condemning you to the river. You see yourself being pulled under by the weight of your heels and pencil skirt and pressed blouse and cheap watch and the meticulously organized contents of your handbag, the compact with the mirror that's always a bit cloudy, the date book, and the extra ballpoint pens you've swiped from the office over the last several months, the pocketbook with the money you've earned by sitting at a desk and smiling at men who call you sweetheart. You are not sweet, but you are also not fearless, and no one would guess that except at this time of day. You know you're safe, but you run anyway because knowing and feeling are very different experiences. And knowing is so often a lie. Running in heels takes commitment. Maintaining your balance mostly comes down to momentum. It helps that you're short and compact, no gangly limbs to wrangle, no unruly center of gravity. You stay well away from the railing, of course, and just far enough from the curb that you're not in danger of pitching into the path of a car if you trip. You've never tripped in more than a year as a working woman, but that's no more reassuring than the raised curb guard. You weave around people crossing from the other side, around people going in the same direction as you, but not quickly enough. You know they won't look askance at you for it. They'll assume you're on a pressing errand and have no time to waste. And in essence, they'll be right. You don't look out at the water, and you don't stumble. Excuse me, miss, but you're already past him, whoever he is. You wouldn't have stopped anyway. It's always somebody wanting money. That's what your father warned you when you first landed your job and started walking through the city alone 5 days a week. You trust your father's warnings. Didn't he tell you not to eat the ice straight off the truck? And didn't you heave your guts up afterward? That minute of miraculous coolness on your tongue paved over by agonies of stomach and soul. Didn't he caution you about the neighbor's dog? And doesn't the scar on your hand still twinge when the weather's turning? Your father steers you toward survival, toward making your own way in the world just long enough to find a husband who can provide for you, whom you will never argue with or even contradict in front of your children. The children whom you will clothe and feed and punish for their moments of carelessness or wastefulness. Steady footfalls on the path of your parents and grandparents, a circle so large that it feels to you like a straight line. You don't stop for anyone. I need to ask you a very important question. is often how it begins. And once somebody followed up by yelling at your receding back, "I only want to ask, why are you so beautiful?" You are not beautiful. You recognize a trap when you see one. You do not listen to lies. "Miss, excuse me." For the rest of your life, when someone says they have something important to ask you, when someone starts a sentence with "why," you will refuse to stop for them. Refuse to believe that there is any answer other than the bills crisply folded into thirds inside your pocketbook. This will be true even 6.5 decades from now, when this bridge has been renamed the DuSable Bridge and you've been rechristened as Mrs., as mom, loving wife, loving grandmother. "I just need the time, miss." And perhaps he does. The thought has the taste of fresh cut ice on your tongue. There are plenty of other people on this bridge alone whom he could ask. Even more people if he presses on back to solid ground where lives don't hang suspended 40 feet above oblivion. This city is full of people who know the time and think they have nothing to fear. But suppose he is deciding at this very moment which direction he ought to go on this bridge. Suppose he's forgotten something at his place of work, but knows he can't be late for whatever his evening holds, and he's stuck here, uncertain if it's early enough for him to double back. Suppose he's still lingering here when the bridge opens up. Without breaking your stride, you hitch up your hand to see your watch. Over your shoulder, you yell, "6:15," and keep running until you reach the other side. Thanks so much for listening, and enjoy the rest of the festival.